Well, if in the first session we looked at the words of Jesus, now we're going to be looking at the actions of Jesus. And this session will have 3 parts. In the first part, we will look at a recent historical case study, which illustrates the truth that humanity is often engaged in conflict as it excludes and demonizes outsiders. In the second part, we shall look afresh at the Gospel of Luke to demonstrate that Jesus's creative, non-violent kingdom action frequently crossed over social and cultural boundary markers with inclusive compassion and transformative love. In the third and final part of this session, we will look at Jesus' incident in the temple to show how Jesus engages in non-violent direct action to challenge a violent ethnocentric nationalism. For the Christ-shaped disciple, parts 2 and 3 will offer fuel for our own contemporary peacemaking imaginations. So let's move on to look at Rwanda. If you were to read Christian mission journals and textbooks from the 1980s, you would see Rwanda held up as a model of evangelization in Africa. Nowhere else on the continent was Christianity so well received. A revival movement spread throughout Rwanda in the latter half of the 20th century. Church growth was unprecedented. In a country where over 85% of the population was Christian, almost everyone gathered on Easter Sunday in 1994 to remember the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. Yet, a week later, an unimaginable darkness descended on Rwanda. The most Christianized country in Africa became the site of its worst genocide. A week after Easter, Christians in Rwanda took up machetes, looked fellow church members in the face, and hacked their bodies to pieces. The history of the church in Rwanda is a tragic historical case study which illustrates that the church which pledges allegiance to Jesus, the Prince of Peace, can also enact an allegiance to powers of racism and division. Between April and July 1994, over a brief span of 100 days, an estimated 800,000 people died. Most of the dead were of the Tutsis tribe, and those who perpetuated the violence were mainly of the Hutus tribe. A church leader sent on behalf of the Pope asked the assembled church leaders, "Are you saying that the blood of tribalism is deeper than the waters of baptism?" And one leader answered, "Yes, it is." Now, it's easy to judge the church in Rwanda. And perhaps we'd say that the humans involved are radically different from ourselves, so they display an unenlightened and uneducated attitudes towards the other. We would never see these kinds of attitudes within the Western world. Yet, this itself only points again to a colonial mindset which judges the outsider, looks down on those who are different. A mindset which, if left unchecked, feeds stereotypes and fuels violence. We would remind ourselves that it was in Europe, in one of the most enlightened, cultured and educated nations, which gave birth to National Socialism. And the church in this context, with notable exceptions, often colluded with the hate and oppression and refused to raise its voice in clear protest. The reality is that prejudice, judgmentalism and favoritism are ghosts which have haunted the church throughout its history and across continents. Although we may pay lip service to the non-violent teaching of Jesus, the ghosts of partiality and preference, to those who are like us haunt our cities, our churches, and even our hearts. There are a number of reasons for this human capacity towards prejudice, but it seems, as recent studies in evolutionary biology have shown, that human beings, whether they be from Africa, America, Asia, or Europe, have a tendency deep within to look down on the outsider, on those who are different than us. Our ancestors, you see, they lived in small social groups that were frequently in conflict with other groups. It was evolutionary. It was functional from an evolutionary perspective to see to view members of other groups as different and potentially dangerous. Differentiating between us and them probably helped us keep safe and free from disease, and as a result, the human brain became very efficient in making these distinctions. Deep within us, perhaps as part of our human depravity, is this tendency for in-group favoritism, which, if unrecognised and unchecked, means that we can implicitly and explicitly place walls between ourselves and the outsider. We can fail to develop friendships with those who are different. In turn, given encouragement from specific social, political, or economic factors, the hidden embers of in-group favoritism and out-group demonization can cause the raging fires of violence, conflict, and war. And do keep this in mind now as we explore the creative peacemaking of Jesus. And so in this section, we're going to explore how Jesus is a creative peacemaker. And in this section, we're going to see that Jesus, there's an inclusivity about him that steps over certain socio and cultural walls. He creates a community where walls are knocked down. In the social and cultural world of Jesus, there are various boundary markers which excluded some people from full participation in a community. Quite literally, there was a sign in Jerusalem which read out, which is a warning to Gentiles. It reads as follows: "No outsider shall enter the protective enclosure around the sanctuary, and whoever is caught will only have himself to blame for the ensuing death." Visible markers marking off who is in and out, but also unspoken assumptions. This inclusive, exclusive grouping would take place through cultural and religious expectations, e.g., who's part of the covenant people of God. It's those who keep the food laws, who keep Sabbath, those who are circumcised. That would define who was in, and then how do you treat the outsider? You push them away. Moreover, in the ancient world, and still in many places of the world today, disability and illness of various kinds would mean exclusion from the religious establishment. In the time of Jesus, that would mean that those who were leprous, those who were blind, those who were deaf, those who were disabled would be excluded from the temple, to be kept away from the presence of God. Moreover, as with contemporary culture, society would often push aside those without economic resources. They'd also push aside women and children. In the ancient world, a high proportion of children would die in infancy. And so parents and society would often see young children as being subhuman before they reached adulthood. Perhaps that was a way of protecting themselves from developing a relationship with a child who would have an increased chance of dying. And then we're reminded that Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me." But in the Greco-Roman world, not so much a Jewish world, the Greco-Roman world, infanticide was often practiced. So if we were to look at mausoleums, at burial sites and gravestones in the Roman world, we might see on a family grave tomb, we might see the mention of a mum and a dad and then the list of kids below it. And time again, when we look at these gravestones, we see that there's far more boys and sons to this couple than there are daughters. So you might find a gravestone with a mum and dad, 5 sons and 1 daughter. Why was this? Was it because there was something in the water back in ancient times which meant you were statistically more likely to give birth to a boy? No, it's because in Greco-Roman society there was often a way infanticide was practiced, that women would be daughters. Perhaps you'd have one you'd keep, but the second one you would leave in the woods for the wolves to take, or leave at the edge of the city. In fact, the ancient church were known for collecting these girls, and its part explains the growth of the early church as the Roman population, non-Christian Roman population, struggled to maintain its population levels, not having enough women there who could breed. That was not true in the Christian world. But in the time of Jesus, women were often looked down upon. In the Jewish world, tax collectors were also seen as collaborators with the oppressive Roman occupation. As Samaritans as well, they'd be seen as a strange cult on a par with dogs. In this context, I want us to focus attention on the Gospel of Luke to illustrate that Jesus, in a world of wars and divisions, Jesus offers a model for contemporary mission and peacemaking. You see, Luke devotes consistent attention to encounters between Jesus and outsiders. Almost on every page, we see Jesus interacting with those who are excluded from the community through disease, ethnicity, immorality, or occupation. Jesus, in other words, works against the grain of in-group favoritism and out-group demonization. He doesn't build walls. He extends tables. Let me offer you 7 highlights for this. In Luke chapter 5, verses 12 to 16, we meet a leper who has physical disfigurement. The ESV actually says he's full of leprosy. He doesn't just have leprosy, he has a lot of it. But this man would also be a social leper. In the ancient world, cut off from friends, family, places of worship, only perhaps feeling comfortable amongst other lepers and social outcasts. Lepers would normally cause people to step back, but Jesus rebels against these cultural expectations and steps forward and touches the one who would see himself as untouchable. The man is not only physically healed, but was also readmitted into the life of the community. Jesus says, go and show yourself to the priest. One may say that Jesus is signposting to an outside agency who could testify of the transformation. So number 1, leper. And number 2, Luke chapter 5, verses 17 to 26, we see Jesus heals a paralyzed man. He's an outsider. He literally couldn't get into the room. Disability access was in need of some serious overhaul. And like Job's friends, perhaps others viewed this paralyzed man as being a sinner. God only smites those who sin. Or from John 9 verse 1, who sinned, this man or his parents? But Jesus says to this outsider, friend, your sins are forgiven. This man is not an outsider, but a friend. He is included in God's missional kingdom project. And the reason for any stigma is also removed, for Jesus declares forgiveness of sins. Jesus does what others said the temple sacrifices could only do. This man was excluded from the temple, but here he is with a front row seat, not on the mercy seat found in the temple, but rather in front of him who is mercy enfleshed. So number 1 was leper, number 2, disabled man, number 3, found in Luke 7, is the centurion's servant who is highly valued, chapter 7 verse 2, and he's ill and he's dying. Perhaps this servant is the gay lover of the centurion, for there is evidence that some Roman soldiers bought slave boys in order to have sex with them. Actually, it's more abusive than that of being a gay lover, but a slave who was used for sex acts. The argument being whether a centurion would go to such lengths to bring shame on himself by contacting a rabbi for help. However, this needs to be balanced with the view that this outsider was also someone who respected the Jews. Either way, the centurion is an outsider and a shop front for the forces of occupation. Yet Jesus includes him and the lower social status slave in his kingdom ministry. Number 1 was the leper. Number 2, the paralyzed man. Number 3, the centurion's servant. Number 4, found in Luke chapter 7, verses 36 to 50, we see Jesus' encounter with a sinful woman, perhaps a prostitute alienated by her own lifestyle and wrongdoing. Jesus not only includes those who have been dealt bad cards by others, but is also inclusive to those who are proactive and complicit in their own marginalization. When Jesus shows compassion to this outsider, it's a challenge to the religious leaders who said, this is Luke 7:29, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. But Jesus stepped over these divides. Number 1, leper. Number 2, paralyzed man. Number 3, centurion's servant. Number 4, a sinful woman. Number 5 is found in Luke chapter 8, verses 26 to 29. Here we see Jesus once again ministering on the edges of Jewish society. For here he encounters a man with what we may say is multiple and complex needs. Someone who presents a whole load of safeguarding issues. The man is socially strange, he exhibits bizarre behaviour. He walks around naked, he lives in a graveyard, he's self-harmed and at times had to be chained up by others. He was living in a Gentile region amongst farmers who kept pigs. From a Jewish religious perspective, could this man be any more of an outsider? Well, yes, because this man is inhabited by demons. Legion, a whole legion of them, perhaps calling the reader to think of the Roman legions. Evil in some sense overwhelms this man and dictates his actions. And what do we see? We see Jesus as the embodiment of love and inclusion. Jesus the peacemaker making a beeline for the broken and bringing hope to the hopeless and bringing love to a man who must have thought that he was unlovable. Number 1, the leper. Number 2, the paralyzed man. Number 3, the centurion's servant. Number 4, the encounter with a sinful woman. Number 5, the Gerasene demoniac. And number 6 and 7, let's put them together. They're found in chapter 19 of Luke, in where we see Jesus in Jericho ministering to Zacchaeus the tax collector and blind Bartimaeus the beggar. Here is an outsider who has been marginalized by poverty and disability, but also a rich man called Zacchaeus who has been marginalized by his wealth and, more importantly, how he obtained it. He was notoriously unpopular as a tax collector. He ripped off his neighbours. He was a collaborator, working with the occupying forces for personal gain. He was despised, but he was not beyond the reach of Jesus or the transforming power of his mercy. Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. In fact, in the Gospels, we often see that Jesus has table fellowship with outsiders. But also he allows himself to receive hospitality from those who are considered as outsiders. In these 7 encounters, Jesus demonstrates his heart for the outsiders, whether they be leprous, paralyzed, a centurion, a slave, a sinful woman, a demoniac, a beggar, or a collaborator. This peacemaking inclusivity embraces both the oppressed and the oppressor. As Jesus himself said in Luke 19, the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Jesus embodies in his life the teaching of the Good Samaritan. He shows neighbourliness and love to those who dwell on the other side of cultural and tribal identities and loyalties. In acting in this inclusive fashion, Jesus demonstrates what proactive peacemaking looks like. He builds authentic community. He embodies love to both neighbour and enemy. He brings healing across tribal, national, religious, cultural and historical boundaries. For this is the way of the kingdom, because it is the way of the King. Jesus' call to the peaceable kingdom not only involves proactive inclusion, but also, as we shall see in the final part of this session, it involves a creative, non-violent truth-telling to systems and structures which propagate violence and division. And so we turn now our attention to the passage which is sometimes referred to as the cleansing of the temple. I'm going to title this part of the talk, Prophetic Peacemaking, Jesus and Civil Disobedience. Jesus' action in the temple appears in all 4 Gospels. We find it in the 3 synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke. Matthew and Luke often offer a shortened account and very likely base themselves on Mark's on Mark's account. They used Mark as a source. Let me just read to you the Markan account. And they came to Jerusalem, that's Jesus and his disciples, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers." This account is also found in John's Gospel. And John seems to use a different source than that of the synoptics. Note also that the synoptic accounts, Matthew, Mark and Luke, appears in the final weeks of Jesus' life, where John's account takes place at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. There's debate within scholarship, and along with the early church, some scholars see Jesus being involved twice in driving people out the temple. In contrast, many New Testament scholars think that it only happened once. It is more probable, they say, that the synoptics have it right, as it makes historical sense that such an incident in the temple would lead to arrest and crucifixion. In this line of argumentation, John has theological and stylistic reasons for including it at the beginning of his ministry. We're going to spend most of our time really riffing off Mark's account, the most extended account of the synoptics and the source for Matthew and Luke. But we'll also bring John's Gospel in at various points. The first thing that we can note is that the account in the temple is pre-arranged and premeditated. And I think we can say this because just a few verses earlier, after Jesus arrives in Jerusalem on a donkey, we read the following words. And he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So Jesus arrives at Jerusalem. He goes and he looks around the temple, but he's aware of the time. And he decides that he's going to go with the 12 to Bethany. And he's going to come back the next day. You see, the temple incident is not to be seen as a rash, spontaneous, angry outburst, but rather we should see it as deliberate and pre-planned. You see, Jesus channels his anger, and he is angry, to participate in a pre-arranged confrontation. Secondly, we should see the temple incident. We should take account of what biblical studies is saying. They are telling us that the temple incident is a prophetic and symbolic act which strikes at the symbolic centre of Israel. You see, Jesus acts from within the Jewish prophetic tradition in providing symbolic actions which creatively speak truth to power through what some have described as sign acts. The action acts as a signpost that speaks truth to the power of the temple and the elite, but also a signpost that opens up the imagination to fresh possibilities. Within the prophetic tradition of Israel, sign acts are found with the prophets. For instance, Isaiah walks around naked and barefoot for 3 years. That's found in Isaiah chapter 20, verse 2. And he does this to point to the fact that the king of Assyria will lead away the exiles. Another example is found in Ezekiel chapter 12, where Ezekiel packs a bag for exile. He digs a hole in the wall of his home, covers his eyes, and he exits through the hole and leaves the city. So Ezekiel, in a sense, performs a prophetic message. And Ezekiel 12 tells us that he does this to show that the people themselves will be led into exile and captivity. And from within the Jesus' ministry, we also see sign acts. When Jesus arrives to Jerusalem on a donkey, when he feeds the 5,000, and at the Last Supper, each of these actions, rooted in the story of Israel, offers a challenge and encourages a fresh imagination for seeing the truth that Jesus is a humble king, a new Moses, and the one who brings the new covenant. N.T. Wright says this: Jesus was capable of acting symbolically and with deliberate scriptural overtones in other situations. We should not be surprised if, faced with the central symbol of Israel, the temple, he did so here as well. We could then view the temple incident as being prophetic art or street theatre that is both provocative and strategic. Third thing that we can get from the temple incident, showing Jesus as a prophetic peacemaker, is that really it involves civil disobedience and non-violent direct action, NVDA. To begin with, the prophetic protest caused for a short while a disruption in the temple. it really acted as a sacrificial and economic embargo. By breaking the law, he was not allowing the money changers or those who keep the sacrifices to continue their trade. No doubt, anger would arise from those who lost finances and those who lost face. But we could also put this in perspective and note that Jesus was not arrested on the spot and actually even returned to the temple a few days later, Mark 13. This can be explained if we recognise that this was a small-scale act of civil disobedience. Now, was the temple incident really, was it actually violent? You know, I'm saying it's NVDA, non-violent. Actually, was it violent? Obviously, it depends on a definition of violence. If a definition of violence includes saying that it causes physical, emotional, or financial harm against a people or their community against their will, then actually, you know, Jesus did cause some distress. So that in one sense, with that definition, it's a violent action. But if we actually mean here, did Jesus punch and hurt people physically? Was Jesus acting against people's best interests? I think we can say that it's non-violent. Let me just bring forward a number of arguments for this. Notice that Jesus makes himself a whip of cords. John chapter 14 verse 15. The Synoptic Gospels don't mention the whip being made, and in fact there's an artistic impression, one of Renaissance artists, which shows Jesus driving a whip and people being scared out of their minds. Now the word used for whip is flagellum, and when used by itself, it consists of a thong or thongs, like a leather belt, with metal tips that would increase the severity of a punishment. It's an instrument of torture, the same as that which is mentioned in the Passion narrative. But notice that the passage says two things. Firstly, Jesus made it. Well, he's going into the temple and he's making this instrument of torture. Where's he getting the metal from? Where's he getting the leather from? No, he fashioned something that's an ad hoc version, which likely didn't include metal shards or leather for thongs. In fact, the narrative tells us that he made it from ekskonion. That's the Greek, but it can be translated as reeds. This type of material was used for animal bedding or food. As Alexei Baker says in his article, Violence and Non-Violence in the Temple Incident, quote, an ad hoc whip of this sort hardly rises to the level of a Roman instrument of torture. In fact, it seems that it's almost a parody of an instrument of torture. It's made of reeds. Or perhaps, as some scholars say, that actually in John's Gospel, if we look at the language, we can see that it's driving away the cattle. It's perhaps some reeds which are cracked together. We'll come to that in a second. Also note that if Jesus had used a weapon, a Roman implement of torture to drive people out, that is, if he acted physically violent against people, one would have expected the temple guards and the Roman soldiers to act quickly and to quell the riot. They do not. Thirdly, Alexei Baker and others provide persuasive and technical support from the Greek to show that the Greek states, or the Greek says, and some modern translations pick this up, that Jesus drove out the sheep and the oxen with the reed whip rather than humans. This rendering is picked up in some modern translations, such as the Good News Translation, Authorized Standard Version, NIV, NRSV, as being, he drove them all, both the sheep and the cattle, from the temple. Jesus, the peacemaker, isn't whipping humans across their faces. He's driving out the sheep and the cattle. Notice also that once he acted with the reed whip, he speaks to those who sold pigeons. It seems that whatever Jesus did with the reed whip, some people had not left the area, and their stock, pigeons in their respective containers or baskets, still seem to be in place, because Jesus then tells them to remove them. We may also say that the explicit teaching of Jesus found elsewhere in the Gospels, love your enemies, turn the other cheek, do not violently oppose an evildoer. And also the fact that Jesus said to Peter, just before he's going to crucifixion, put down your sword. These things, this explicit teaching, would suggest to us that we should understand the temple incident in a non-violent way, that Jesus is acting in a coherent and a unified manner. Given these 5 arguments that I've just mentioned, let me just run through them. One is to do with that it's a whip of cords that he's made. It's a whip of reeds, almost a parody of a weapon. That's number one. Secondly, the argument that if Jesus had used a Roman implement of torture, we'd expect him to get arrested straight away. Thirdly, the Greek technical argument, which is used by many and picked up in translation, that it was only the sheep and the cattle that were driven, that almost Jesus is like cracking the whip and getting them out. Fourthly, the fact that he speaks to those who sold pigeons and their stock is still in place. And fifthly, the argument of kind of coherent with the rest of Jesus' ministry. Given these 5 arguments, we are led to the point whereby we don't have to see the temple incident as described in John or the other Gospels as being violent. As Greg Boyd, pastor theologian, comments, there is therefore nothing about Jesus' cleansing of the temple that runs counter to my claim that the non-violent, enemy-embracing, self-sacrificial love that was supremely revealed on the cross is the thematic centre of Jesus' identity and mission. To the contrary, Jesus engaged in this street theatre out of love for his Father's house, as well as for the poor who were being oppressed by the corrupt leaders who ran the temple's buying and selling system. And as the Gospels make clear, he confronted these leaders in this aggressive manner as a way of forcing their hand, and thus as a stepping stone to his crucifixion. Far from illustrating Jesus acting in an unloving, let alone violent way, I submit that this entire episode reflects Jesus' self-sacrificial love. And so we have seen so far that this is a pre-prepared, symbolic sign act which involves civil disobedience and NVDA. But also I would say that this is a justice and peace shaped protest. If Jesus then is offering a prepared symbolic action which speaks truth to power, we may ask what truth he is seeking to communicate. Here the synoptics and John offer 2 differing but related perspectives. From Matthew, Mark and Luke, we see Jesus saying the following: and he was teaching them and saying to them, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. Jesus' statement here brings together two passages from the prophetic. One of them comes from a passage in Isaiah 56 verse 7, and the other from Jeremiah 7 verse 11. By the way, New Testament writers often seem to have used Old Testament passages contextually. So it's not just simply a matter of reading the one verse, but actually reading the Old Testament verse in its context. So let's look at Isaiah chapter 56 verse 7. This quotation comes from a part of an Isaiah that is eschatologically inclusive. It looks to a time when Yahweh will act in history to bring about the age to come. According to Isaiah 56, this will come about when people keep justice and keep righteousness. The result of this will be the ushering in of the new age. This new age, what we may call the arrival of the kingdom of God, will be inclusive to eunuchs. In Leviticus, they're excluded from the sacred assembly, but here they are with a front row seat at the eschaton. The new age will include foreigners and include outcasts. God's house will be a house for all nations. There's no apartheid, no separation. The eschaton includes all. The second part of Jesus' saying is from Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 11. It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer. That's from Isaiah. But you have made it into a den of robbers. You have made it into a den of robbers. Comes from Jeremiah chapter 7 verse 11, which reads as follows. Has this house which is called by my name become a den of robbers in your eyes? Behold, I myself have seen it, declares the Lord. In its larger context, Jeremiah contains a speech which Jeremiah gave in the temple. A speech where Jeremiah calls God's people to repent or they will face judgment. Jeremiah urges the people to execute justice and repent, for they have been oppressing the foreigner. They've been committing idolatry and spilling innocent blood. Within this context, the voice of Yahweh speaks through Jeremiah, saying, has this house which is called by my name become a den of robbers? The Hebrew word Paris is what stands behind the word translated as robbers. Now that Hebrew word is associated with violence or being a brigand. This meaning is brought over into the Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint, often represented by the letters LXX. So that Hebrew word, Paris, is translated in the Greek as lestes. And the evangelists, they're quoting really from the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Now here's what's interesting. The word lestes is loaded. It does not simply refer to con men or swindlers, but is instead a word which is used to describe brigands or revolutionaries. It is the very word used by the Jewish historian to describe those who would attack and wage war with Rome in the years leading up to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. It is more closely associated with our concepts of terrorists, insurrectionists, guerrillas, highwaymen or bandits than it is with the concept of con men or swindler. It's the same word used to describe those who were crucified with Jesus, and also that which was used to describe Barabbas in John 18 verse 40. From John's Gospel, so here in the synoptics, this is a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of terrorists. You've made this place which is to be a light to all. Instead, you've made it as a place where you plot violence against the outsider. From John's perspective, we can add an extra we see an extra perspective which reinforces the target of Jesus' action. John tells us that Jesus poured out the money from the money changers, and he overturned the table, saying, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." In other words, Jesus is angry at the commerce taking place in the temple courts. Why? Animal sacrifices and the trade associated were part and parcel of worship. Perhaps Jesus shared with others the view that, and here I'm quoting from N.T. Wright and Michael Bird's book, The New Testament and Its World. Many of the disadvantaged within Jerusalem saw the temple as standing for everything that was oppressing them: the rich, corrupt aristocracy, and its systemic injustices. A sign of this attitude was the telltale actions of the rebels during the war. When they took over the temple, they did the ancient equivalent of destroying the central computer in a bank. They burned all the records of debt. So it seems as if in John's gospel, the element that is emphasized is the economic exploitation. We should also note another reason, which shows itself across all four gospels. In overturning the tables, Jesus is announcing the destruction of the temple. We can get to this view by looking at the literary technique in Mark's Gospel, which is known as the Markan sandwich, in which a short story of Jesus is sandwiched between and breaks up a larger story in such a way that the bread helps us interpret the filling. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus' temple incident is sandwiched between the story of the withered tree. In short, using this Markan sandwich technique, just as Jesus, this is the interpretation Mark is leading us to, just as Jesus has come looking for fruit on the tree and it's cursed, so Jesus enacts destruction on the temple because he cannot find fruit. Note as well that all of this happens before Mark 13, in which Jesus predicts the destruction of Jerusalem. Putting all these things together, we may say that Jesus offers a powerful sign act at the heart of Jerusalem, which speaks truth to power. In overturning tables, he is saying in a powerful performance that caused disruption, that was pre-planned, he's saying that the city and the people are not living up to their calling to be a house of prayer for all nations. Instead of being missionally inclusive and a light to the nations, the temple has become a place where they plot and plan the overthrow of Rome. Alongside this violent nationalism, the temple is using its power and its privilege to exploit the poor. Because of this, Jesus says judgment will come in the form of conflict and defeat by Rome. This, the nation will, according to Jesus' sign act, be overturned like tables. If you sow into violent nationalism and economic exploitation, Jesus may well be saying you're going to reap a whirlwind and catastrophe. And so, looking in detail at the temple incident, we've seen that it's prearranged and it's premeditated. It's a sign act which is symbolic. It includes civil disobedience and non-violent direct action. And it was shaped. It was a protest which was justice and peace, kingdom shaped. And so in this session, we've travelled a long way. We've gone into quite some detail there about the temple incident. But in this session, we've seen two sides to Jesus' teaching. Firstly, constructively, Jesus engages in creative peacemaking by crossing over traditional boundaries to show love and compassion. And secondly, we have noted that Jesus engages in prophetic peacemaking through non-violent direct action. Jesus is civilly disobedient. He breaks the laws to speak truth to power and to warn the community in Jerusalem that if they continue their direction of travel, it will end in catastrophe. As we close this session, why don't we say together 3 times the words, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers. Amen.